There are also two contemporary treaties known as the Treaty of Breda. The Declaration of Breda was a proclamation by Charles II of England in which he promised a general pardon for crimes committed during the English Civil War and the Interregnum for all those who recognized Charles as the lawful king, the retention by the current owners of property purchased during the same period, religious toleration, and a payment of pay arrears to members of the army, and that the army would be recommissioned into service under the Crown. The first three pledges were all subject to amendment by Acts of Parliament. Backgrounds. The declaration was written in response to a secret message sent by General George Monk, who was then in effective control of England. On the 1st of May 1660, the contents of the declaration and accompanying letters were made public. The next day Parliament passed a resolution that government ought to be by King, Lords and Commons, and Charles was invited to England to receive his crown. On the 8th of May Charles was proclaimed king. On the advice of Monk, the Commons rejected a resolution put forward by jurist Matthew Hale for a committee to be formed to look into the concessions offered by Charles, and to negotiate conditions with the king such as those put forward to his father in the Treaty of Newport. The declaration was named after the city of Breda in the Netherlands. It was actually written in the Spanish Netherlands, where Charles had been residing since March 1656. However, at the time of writing, England had been at war with Spain since 1655. To overcome the difficulties, both practical and in terms of public relations, of a prospective King of England addressing his subjects from enemy territory, Monk advised Charles to relocate himself to the United Netherlands, and to date his letters as if they were posted from Breda. Charles left Brussels, his last residence in the Spanish Netherlands, and passing through Antwerp arrived in Breda on the 4th of April, and resided there until the 14th of May. Then he travelled to The Hague, where he was received by the States General of the Netherlands as a ruling King of England and grandiosely entertained, and departed for England on the 2nd of June from Scheveningen on the HMS Royal Charles, the former Naseby, which was renamed on arrival at the Dutch coast. The declaration, however, was dispatched as soon as Charles had crossed the border of the Dutch Republic, and was dated the 4th of April, the 14th of April. Contents. The declaration was drawn up by Charles and his three chief advisers, Edward Hyde, the Marquess of Ormond, and Sir Edward Nicholas, in order to express the terms by which Charles hoped to take up the possession of that right which God and nature hath made our due. The declaration promised a free and general pardon to any old enemies of Charles and of his father who recognized Charles II as the lawful monarch, excepting only such persons as shall hereafter be accepted by Parliament. However, it had always been Charles's expectation, or at least that of his Chancellor Edward Hyde, that all who had been immediately concerned in his father's death should be punished, and even while at a disadvantage. While professing pardon and favour to many, he had constantly accepted the regicides. Once Charles was restored to the throne, on his behalf Hyde steered the Indemnity and Oblivion Act through Parliament. The Act pardoned most who had sided with Parliament during the Civil War, but accepted the regicides. Two prominent unrepentant Republicans, John Lambert and Henry Vane the Younger, and around another 20 were forbidden to take any public office or sit in Parliament. In the declaration, Charles promised religious toleration in areas where it did not disturb the peace of the kingdom, and an active Parliament for the granting of that indulgence. However, Parliament chose to interpret the threat of peace to the kingdom to include the holding of public office by non-Anglicans. Between 1660 and 1665, the Cavalier Parliament passed 4 statutes that became known as the Clarendon Code. These severely limited the rights of Catholics and non-conformists reformists, such as the Puritans, who had reached the zenith of their influence under the Commonwealth, effectively excluding them from national and local politics. The Declaration undertook to settle back pay of General Monk's soldiers. The landed classes were reassured that establishing the justice of contested grants and purchases of estates that had been made in the continued distractions of so many years and so many and great revolutions was to be determined in Parliament. Charles II appeared to have offered something to everyone in his terms for resuming government. Copies were delivered to both houses of the Convention Parliament by Sir John Grenville. Other copies with separate covering letters were delivered to Lord General George Monk to be communicated to the Lord President of the Council of State and to the officers of the Army under his command, and to the generals of the Navy at sea, and to the Lord Mayor of the City of London. Commemoration. Several British warships would be named HMS Breda after the declaration.